Morning, everyone. Welcome to the next installment of the JKMRC Friday morning seminar series that take place here at the Indurapilli Lecture Theatre, as well as online. My name is Katerina, and myself and Karina are the co-hosts of the seminar series and are taking turns introducing the speakers this year. On behalf of the University of Queensland and the Sustainable Minerals Institute, we'd like to respectfully acknowledge all traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we all meet today. We pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country, and we recognize their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. Our speaker today is SMI's very own Ben Seligmann. Ben is a research fellow in risk management at the Minerals Industry Safety and Health Center, otherwise known as MISC. Ben is a risk specialist, systems thinker, and teacher. Over the last 10 years, he has worked in academia, engineering, consulting, HSE, and risk and compliance across mining, infrastructure, healthcare, and the education and the industries. He holds a PhD in chemical engineering from the University of Queensland, and his research interests are in frontiers of risk management, risk assessment in practice, modeling of accident scenarios, and trying to engage with the complexity of socio-technical industrial systems. Whoa. So today's presentation is about the complex process that is mine closure, and it is titled Optimizing Mine Closure with Causal Network Topology Analysis. Please let's welcome Ben to the podium.
Thanks very much. And I hope everyone can hear me. The microphone is working. People on Zoom, just give a yell if you can or can't, I should say. So thanks for having me today. My name's Ben, if I haven't met you before. I'm from MISC and have just moved back to St. Lucia at this point. And as Kat said, I've got a chemical engineering background and work in risk management now. And so you might be wondering, what am I doing talking about closure? So one of my research interests that have been developed over the last couple of years is a particular kind of risk analysis technique called Causal Network Topology Analysis. And many of you may have heard this. I talk about this quite a lot around here. Over the last 6 months or so, or maybe last year, it's become increasingly apparent of the diversity of places this technique could be applied, including mine closure. And that's what we're talking about today. Click on the right place. There we go. Okay. So to start off with the elephant in the room, closure is complex. We know this for a number of reasons, not least of which there's not a lot of successful examples of it. One reason closure is complex is that the different stakeholders speak different languages. Now, this is a metaphor, but it does speak to this reality that each stakeholder, such as mining company executives or the local community or the regulator, have a different framework or set of key questions they're asking with a related set of methods and for achieving a particular set of goals, as I've indicated up here. For example, mining company executives, now this is a generalization, but they tend to frame the closure problem around how do I divest ourselves or our company of this situation at the lowest cost. So their goal is around minimizing the cost of closure. The methods they use to do that are by employing accountants, by looking at financial metrics, measuring NPV, using engineering design approaches, and delegating to other groups in their companies. The closure team, though, is a little bit different inside a company. So their focus is achieving the closure plan, which often boils down to achieving environmental benefits or the appropriate environmental benefits of the site. And the methods they're using there are about methods around ecology and ecosystem trajectory modeling, water management, hydrogeology, this kind of thing. The local community is looking at this very differently. The kinds of questions that get asked by the local community can tend to be more around, for example, how can our unresolved grievances that were generated during the mine life, how can they be resolved now that the mine's closing? Or how can our community thrive once this is all gone and there aren't any jobs anymore? Again, these are generalizations, but you can see that it's quite different. So the goal for them, generally speaking, is around how do we have a community living near the mine or in that area post-closure that's thriving. And the methods they have for doing this are quite different. It's about negotiating with mining companies or the regulator. And the regulator themselves tend to be focused on environmental benefits and trying to achieve rehabilitation or equivalent. And the way they do that, the methods are around giving guidelines or regulations to industry and doing auditing and things like that. The key idea here is meaning. Each stakeholder frames the closure problem according to what is meaningful to them. Different outcomes for closure are meaningful to different stakeholders because each stakeholder values these outcomes differently. Therefore, they have different goals for closure, like I said, put up here, and therefore they see different risks. And they have different methods for achieving those goals, which translates to they have different methods for treating that risk. These methods and the methods they use are seen as meaningful to them. They're actually capable of achieving their goals. So it's not just the way they frame the problem, the framing questions here, that are derived from what is meaningful to each stakeholder, but the methods for achieving those goals are derived from that as well. So that's the first common ground or some common ground to unite stakeholders around. We're all seeking to create or protect what we value through what we see as a meaningful way of doing this. What we value is meaningful to us, and our approach to closure reflects this. So stakeholders want different things, is the summary. Therefore, they're biased towards identifying threats or risks to their goals and being focused on the type of interventions for addressing those particular threats. Same goes for promoting opportunities. This means having different goals and framework and methods for achieving them indicates the risks each stakeholder sees will be different, as I mentioned before, and even the same risks will be prioritized differently. This makes a key decision in closure very difficult, that of determining if a site has low enough residual risk to be acceptable, or at least tolerable to all stakeholders. So nevertheless, it's important, for example, for the regulator to actually create regulations around defining residual risk for companies and for mining companies to meet and design their obligations. We still have to do something, even if it's not super clear if we can define if the residual risk is low enough for everybody. So we need to have a clear and integrated approach to defining and determining residual risk for closure. Now, just to clarify, I'm framing the question of how to optimize closure in terms of how to optimize the reduction of negative risks to as low as reasonably practicable, so that that risk is low enough, acceptably low enough for all stakeholders. Now, that's not the only way to frame how to optimize closure. That's just the framework that I'm coming from. So just wanted to point that out. Okay. So as I mentioned before, closure is complex. And there are lots of different kinds of risks, and you can read them up there, that relate to this scenario. As I just mentioned, there are many often competing goals that are trying to be achieved and a diverse network of risks to manage. Optimizing how we do this would be good. So the particular approach we're talking about today is called Causal Network Topology Analysis, which takes all these individual closure risks and through the identification of their causal relationships, generates a causal network, which then you can analyze, which I'll show you how in a minute, to help you to optimize how we do closure, how we manage all of these risks together. So CaNeTA is the shorthand way of saying causal network topology analysis. It facilitates the translation and integration of risk information from all relevant stakeholders and data sources into a causal network, which is a network of interconnected risk events, their causes, consequences, and controls, and then analyzes the structure of these networks or the topology to help us make better decisions. That's the intention. This approach provides insight, or the intention is that it provides insight about the closure scenario that perhaps wasn't obvious before when you were only looking at one risk source at a time. And I said before, the intention of doing this is to enhance how we make decisions about closure risk treatment, to intentionally optimize how closure progresses overall. Okay, so to work through how CaNeTA works and how all this actually plays out in practice, and why this might be a useful approach of translating risk information and then integrating it to look at it all together. Let's start with the normal picture of risk management. So one way risk management is useful is to help us make decisions about things, about how do we treat undesired risks. So when establishing a closure scenario, you start the risk management process of that with establishing the context. So describing the system, describing the scope of the risks you're trying to look at, the goals of the system, things like that, what you accept as acceptable, etc. Then follows a normal practice of identifying risks, analysing them, evaluating them, and making some decision about, do we need to treat them and how do we treat them to intentionally bring the system to a acceptable end state, or if it is already on that trajectory, to keep it on that trajectory. We know this process well, and this is very well established in a lot of organisations. However, there are some weaknesses with how real risk management plays out in real organisations that make managing residual risk of closure to as low as reasonably practicable even trickier. Let's look at a few of these problems. So problem number one, we can't see the forest for the trees. One problem with risk assessment is that we can't see the forest for the trees. This managing the bigger picture of how all risks and controls for a closure scenario are interrelated can be difficult. Risk registers don't do it very well. The management of each individual risk might be optimized, but the management of all risks together might be suboptimal. It's very hard to see how all the risk events are connected, causally connected. That's the forest we can't see because we're focused on all the individual trees, all the individual risks, trying to make sure that they're all captured or protected or controlled in some way. We focus a lot of effort necessarily on making sure each individual risk is well understood and has sufficient controls. But what this approach misses is that each risk event sits in a much larger context, a causal flow of all the events, all the risks relevant to that closure scenario. For example, one risk's consequence could be the cause of something else. It's a problem if there's minimal information about whether a risk event occurs upstream or downstream or in the middle of a larger causal scenario. This is because the location of an event in the overall scenario affects its importance. For example, it might be more important to address a lower consequence event that's near the beginning of a scenario, causally speaking, first, in preference to the larger consequence events at the end, because those earlier events can cause lots of other things to happen. That's not always the case, but if you can see that, you can then use that information to help inform your decision making. Problem number two, heterogeneous data sources. So there are many data sources and data types where your risk information about closure is held. So in closure risk registers, in written documents or interview transcripts or closure reports, or statements from community members, in photos, and time series data like rainfall and dam water levels and things like that. You might have simulation results. So Monte Carlo simulation results about water quality releases, that kind of thing. We might have bushfire frequency data. We might have ecosystem trajectory models. We might have hazard identification results. Now, my point is there's relevant information about the different risks relevant to closure, but they're all held in different places in different data formats. Mapping from each of these data formats into one common language for risk events and their connections is non-trivial. But without doing so, again, you're only seeing part of the scenario at a time. So to address these two problems, and this is not an exhaustive list of weaknesses with risk management practice in general, but it's just a snapshot. To address these two problems, we need to do two things. We need to translate from each stakeholder's natural language about risks, causes, and consequences into a common vocabulary or a common set of concepts so that we can integrate this information together, frame key questions to answer in order to enable and to optimize closure. So to be able to reach or get close to consensus on whether a closure process is successful, assuming for the moment that getting consensus between stakeholders is one of the goals of closure and one of the ways that, it's meaningful for residual risk to be allowed, we need a way of translating from what is meaningful to each stakeholder in terms of what goals they have and what methods they see as useful together into a common frame of reference so that the risks and their causes and consequences can be integrated together. This allows much greater capacity for learning about what the risk network looks like for all stakeholders in the one view, and opens the door to a number of ways of analysing such a network for enhancing risk treatment in an attempt to optimise closure. So how does this actually work? Where do we start with this thing called Causal Network Topology Analysis? So Causal Network Topology Analysis, or CaNeTA, is a method that facilitates this translation and integration in a really helpful way. The place to start with the translation is to use a clear and sufficiently abstract and fundamental definition for what an event is. Such a definition can be meaningful in all reference frames, or at least in many, from many points of view, from many stakeholders' perspectives, as well as across the results of different methods used to describe and analyse risk. So let's come back to the idea that one risk's consequence is another one's cause. So for the first thing to note is with a sufficiently abstract definition of an event, which I'll show you in a minute, this leads to the conclusion that risk events, things that we label as risk events, causes, consequences, control failures, they're really all the same thing. They're all types of events that can happen. And this is an important point to note and allows us to, that's why the causal network has value. So the definition of an event I'm using, therefore the way we define an event is critical, for it must be abstract enough to be applicable in as many circumstances as possible. So this is the definition that we use in CaNeTA, okay? And I've got two examples following this. So an event is a change in a property value beyond a particular threshold where that event or that change is embedded in space and time. A property simply is some feature of the system of interest. So the system of interest for closure is the landform and related ecosystem and perhaps the related communities. And the properties of a system make up its state, okay? So let's talk through an example. Here's two examples. The first one, example one. So this is the kind of event you might see from a HAZOP or a risk register. Increase pressure in pipe one. The property here is pressure of the fluid. The term increase implies a change in the value beyond of the pressure beyond some accepted threshold, presumably defined elsewhere. This change will occur over a finite time period, even if that's very short. And pipe one denotes the location of the event being associated with some region of space. Let's look at another example. So this might be an example of a statement from a community consultation session, potentially. When the mine closes, everyone in town won't have work for ages. So there are two events buried in this statement. The first is about the mine closing. The property here is the closure status of the mine. The change is that it is closing, and the threshold is very clear. You can tell the difference between the mine being open and the mine being closed. The fact that the mine itself has a location in space is clear, and the actual time it takes for the mine to cease operations has a time period associated with it. And the second event is about the work in the town, and I'll leave that to you to work out how you apply the definition. But the point here is having a sufficiently generic definition of an event like this means that you can apply it in many different circumstances to different data and to different stakeholders, and it still can be relevant. So practically, once you've got all your events, what the CaNeTA approach does is it converts where you've got your events listed. So let's just look at risk registers for the moment, okay? It converts a risk register into what we call an adjacency matrix, which is just a way we capture the logical relationships, the causal relationships between the events, okay? this is the adjacency matrix is the mathematical description of the causal links between events that can be, and this is what is converted into the causal network directly. So this is just background information. You don't have to remember this. This is the background process. Okay. So so you can see there in terms of the red and blue circles on the risk register, the causal links between the events are embedded in things like risk registers. So for example, the event in the middle, altered wildlife behavior, is a risk event. It's got a consequence, impact on wildlife health, and you can see there's an arrow between them. So that logical relationship is reflected in the adjacency matrix and then pulled across into form part of the causal network. Similarly, the cause of the altered wildlife behavior up there is site-generated noise and vibration, for example, and it's got two prevention controls on it, those two blue circles. And so all three of those events can point to, yes, Rick. The dots on the diagram, that's an excellent question, Rick. All the events in the risk register correspond to the dots on the diagram, the nodes in the network, okay? And the arrows between the events, between the dots, the nodes in the network, correspond to the causal relationships, those arrows in the risk register that I showed you there. So at this stage of the analysis, the labels cause, and once you've got the causal network, the labels cause and consequences and risk event don't matter anymore. They're all fundamentally the same thing. Treating them as the same thing allows any event where relevant to be causally connected to another event where that link is plausible. But it's not just risk registers that can be converted into causal networks. In a sense, everything is an event. The different way risks can be framed from the perspectives of different stakeholders can be translated into a generic abstract definition of an event so they can be causally related to one another. Since the definition for an event is abstract like this, we can use it for many data sources that contain relevant information about closure risks. This is a way of integrating the methods that different stakeholders use, since in effect, we're integrating the results of each method. Blending many methods together into one method is hard, but it's much easier to identify relevant events across many data sources like this from the results of each method and then integrate them. Here's a few examples of risk events across different data sources that might be related to closure. So for example, there might be statements from community sentiment that meet that value, like those examples we looked at before that we can extract. There might be closure reports from previous closed mines that might be relevant. Ecosystem trajectory models. These are events can be explicitly captured from these, since those models on the top right there identify deviations from a particular state trajectory, which is how an event is described. This is the same concept as what HAZOP relies on, so deviations from a desired state. Historical bushfire mapping, you see up there, the map of Queensland there, it gives you sites and frequencies of fires. These can be converted into events too, or events can be identified from them using this definition. And there are other things, checklists and audits from the government, closure risk registers, water quality models, and water quantity models, such as when large rainfall events happen. So yes, so the message here is, using a generic enough definition for an event, you can identify closure risk events from anywhere and pull them together. As an example of this translation effort, I thought I'd throw in a little bit about last year here at the SMI, we were able to do a small CaNeTA analysis on the Izok Lake risk project, which is in Canada, or potentially in Canada. And the point of showing you this is, although this project wasn't a closure, didn't have anything to do with closure, it did represent the need to connect multiple stakeholders together in a risk workshop setting. And what we found was, and some of you were there for that, this translated to participants from all the centres in the SMI who were involved in that project coming to a risk workshop where we identified project feasibility risks from the perspectives of all our different disciplines, mineral exploration and geology and mine planning and tailings management, etc. We analysed three different processing scenarios and built a risk register from this using the classic tools of writing risk events on Post-its and sticking them up on the board. In fact, it was in this room that we did this. Interestingly, because everyone in the room knew that the goal was to take the results and build a causal network, they started almost automatically drawing arrows between their Post-its on the board. In fact, on the tables. I won't tell you who it was, but I do remember someone defacing a table, drawing lines on there, using whiteboard markers. You can see the evidence of this in some of the pictures on the slide there. This was a surprising result, but a welcome one, because it changed the tone of the day. Instead of sitting down all day staring at a risk register in Excel, which is what we typically do, people were up and moving and talking and drawing together, and it was quite interactive. And it was democratic, thinking about different stakeholders' perspectives, right? Anyone could add Post-its at the same time, avoiding the problem of the loudest voice in the room dominating the conversation, which can often happen in these settings. And then anyone could draw causal links between Post-its or groups of Post-its. This is an example of how you can use the process of building a causal network together as an act of co-creation between stakeholders. Bringing different stakeholders together, this way of running a risk workshop could help diverse stakeholders communicate and create something together that represents all of their views in an integrated way. It's integrated because they are actively looking for ways to draw arrows between Post-its. This helps to connect their worlds. This helps to translate risk information into a common discourse, in a sense, so it can be analysed in an integrated way, which will help optimise risk management efforts. But we can go further than this. So it's in CaNeTA, the key artifact of study is not the individual events, but the causal scenario as a whole. So causal scenarios are made of events, that's the dots in the network, the nodes in the network, and their causal relationships between them. Those events we identified from each data source, from each method used by the different stakeholders, they're now being framed, those events are, within a common definition that we mentioned earlier. So they can be literally put into the same data format, an input file. The causal links between them can be explicitly made. The information for what those links are come from discipline knowledge more directly, rather than not from the network stuff. So for example, flooding on a tailings dam where there's a potential for AMD, flowing into local rivers that affects biodiversity. The causal links between all those events doesn't come from risk management. It comes from the environmental people and the mining people who know about that. So that's all that information is still important. We just use a table, like a risk register format, to capture the data, but because the causal links are embedded where the events sit in that template, you can build these causal networks from that. Okay, how does this help you? Why do we do this? How does this help closure? There are three key advantages this approach gives you. The first one is, the big point is that you can analyze the topology or the structure of this. That is, having the causal network means you can analyze it using what are called network metrics derived from graph theory in mathematics. This facilitates learning many things of this overall causal scenario. For example, you can look for what risk events you might be missing. For example, if there's a number of different what are called disconnected subgraphs, so bits of the network that are split up that aren't connected, it immediately begs the question, should those be connected together? Are we missing a few links there? And simple, so that's it. When you just look at it, the network, that's a natural question to ask. You can see that in the previous slide. In the top right there in the network, there's a little group of risks that are not connected to anything else. Why would that be? Have we just missed a few things? Or is there actually some sort of spatial disconnect in those? I don't know. It's worth looking at. The point is, it prompts you to ask that question. Second thing, what are the key risks that are predominantly driving or derailing the closure scenario? The most important set of risks to focus on might not be what you expect because of where they sit in the overall network. And the third advantage, this is not exhaustive as well, what is the set of risks I need to treat first in order to make the residual risk as low as reasonably practicable? And what order do I treat those risks in? This is a way of learning about the fragility and the complexity of your risk network, not just the set of risks, but the network of them, how they causally interconnect. So let's go through these three advantages with an example closure scenario. So this is an example closure risk register that we're working from. I know you can't see that what the events are. I have some examples in a minute. But remember, the first advantage is just looking at the network and asking what can we learn from that. Are you missing connections between islands of risks, groups of risks? So this is the picture I was pointing at before. See, in the top right, there's a little group of risks sitting up by themselves, not doing anything. Why aren't they connected to all the other environmental risks down here? That's a good question. Are they really not connected? That sort of reflection on your own practice and reflection on our risk identification process is one of the great advantages of using causal networks, because that step can be lost. Paul.
Sorry, which way is
Oh, yes, you can if you zoom in a long way. The arrows just happen to be very small.
Okay.
Yes, you can. Yes, it's a directed graph. So there are arrows between things. Thank you. I appreciate that.
I wanted to ask a question too.
Yeah.
Again, it's due to lack of comprehension of how these graphs work, but is there some reason that whatever the directionality it is, that there seems to be one direction where the number of events is always decreasing and another direction where it's always increasing? Like when you go from outside to inside, is that the direction you're going in general, that a series of events is converging on a progressively smaller number of events and associated consequences, and is that a general principle? Because sometimes I would have thought that one event could lead to a whole bunch of bad shit happening.
So first of all, yes, you have noticed a trend that tends to appear in most causal networks that come from risk registers, which is there tends to be a large set of causes on the boundary which don't have any causes themselves. So events on the boundary that have no input, no causes themselves, and then those point to particular risk events which point to particular consequences. And what tends to happen is that, as you say, Rick, it looks like it's converging on a much smaller set of events. That is a trend across many causal networks. And that's an open research question as to why that is. I basically think the answer is it's because of that completely reflects how people think about doing risk assessment when they're using a risk register. Because if you use different kinds of methods for capturing your risk data, you don't see the same trend. So, for example, the very structure of a risk register, it gets you to start with what's a risk event? And then it says, what are all the causes? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 causes. What are all the consequences? 1 or 2 causes. So the sort of atomic structure of a causal network built from a risk register. You get key events with inputs, a lot of inputs and outputs. What tends to happen is that leads to convergence. But that says more about the template you're using to capture it than the actual reality, because different hazard identification methods don't get you to think like that. So it's a very good point. To identify things like that, thank you, Rick, for the segue, you can use what I mentioned before, network topology metrics, to help you to find causally important events buried in this network. Now, this one was only about 80 events or something like, or 180 events, I can't remember. When you have more like 300 or 3,000, it's much harder to see where I might need to focus in terms of treating them. So we use network topology metrics. So these groups of metrics fall into two categories. One, metrics that apply to individual events, individual nodes, and ones that apply to the whole network, okay? So for example, some metrics that apply to individual nodes, let's start with the degree. It's the purple dot up there. So the degree of that, now this is just an example network, of that node is 4 because it has 4 connections. The degree of a node measures the number of connections that node has. In a causal network, that corresponds to the number of causes and consequences a particular event has. And just even intuitively speaking, if an event has a lot more causes and consequences than another one, you might naturally think this one's more causally important. It's being caused by more things and it's causing more things than this one over here. So in terms of how do I treat my risks, I would want to start by looking at this one. But that's not the only way you can look at these networks, because there are lots of other metrics. For example, the blue dot there, the blue node there, the betweenness. So the betweenness is another kind of metric which measures the number of causal pathways that goes through a particular node. So you can see there that that blue dot only has a degree of 2, right? It's got 2 links, and the other one has 4. But because it's sitting on a kind of a bridge between these 2 groups of two groups of nodes, imagine if you prevented that risk there, suddenly half the events in the network don't happen anymore. I've been able to make that decision about treating a particular risk based on a different metric from just the number of causes and consequences, based on where it sits, based on its betweenness. Using lots of metrics like this allows us to think quite richly about how we treat the risks in a causal network. And then you can do things like visualize this. So this is the same network we saw before, and the degree of all the nodes are just represented by the color those nodes have. So the more red it is, the more connections it has, the more causes and consequences it has in this context. And I've listed a few of the events out over there, the high degree events. So the top one there on the right-hand side, the red node 109, sustainability of native revegetation not achieved, which has quite a high degree, as you can see there, degree of 21. But there are other ones there too. The mine closes early, legal obligations not met, that kind of thing. Using the topology metrics helps you to learn about these different groups of events and what are the key drivers of the scenario. This helps with your planning. Similarly, we can do the same for the betweenness. And you can see that it looks a little bit different. A lot of the nodes that are grayed out have a betweenness of 0, right? They're not on a bridge between anywhere. And those top 3 risks that we saw before, they're still the top 3 because of where they sit in terms of their betweenness scores. But there are 2 others there that suddenly popped into the top 5 that weren't on the previous list. If you look at that, you see? Mining infrastructure removal and land not able to sustain target native vegetation growth. By looking at multiple metrics, you see different risks are important for different reasons. And so it's worthwhile looking at a number of them for really getting a rich understanding of what's going on. And this obviously leads us to the point of view that, well, why don't we combine a whole heap of metrics together? Which is what we can do. So above, we show the top events in the network in terms of their score, in terms of their combination of 3 metrics. So this is the metrics we were using here was the betweenness, and then the in degree and the out degree. Now, so when you add the in degree and the out degree together, that gives you the degree of a node. So the number of causes, number of consequences. You can see that those 2 events we looked at before, sustainability of native revegetation not achieved and mine closes early, stick out quite a bit more than all the other events in the network, indicating they're quite a bit more important for a number of different reasons because of their combined metric score. So again, this is all about when you're looking at multiple metrics, the big question to keep coming back to is what can I learn from the metric value for each node? CaNeTA is not a panacea that tells you you must do this, or this is the one answer of how to optimize mine closure. It just opens a new door or a new way of thinking about managing these risks. The third advantage is about this, what's the optimal order in which we treat risks? One way to explore how to optimize closure, how to treat closure risks is an attempt to reduce the overall residual risk to as low as reasonably practicable. Okay, and one way to do that is to examine the fragility of the closure causal network. So there's a particular analysis you can do with a network that calculates how easy it is to break apart when nodes are selectively removed. This is called a robustness analysis. So you remove nodes one at a time according to some way of selecting those nodes, those events. At each step, you also remove any other nodes that don't have connections anymore. After each of those removal steps, you count how many nodes are remaining in the network. And then you can plot the number of remaining nodes against the number of nodes removed. And this gives you a graph like the one you see here. Now, this graph characterizes how easy or efficient it is to break apart the entire network. This curve characterizes the network fragility. The interpretation of robustness analysis for a causal network is that each node removal step is a model for treating or preventing events from happening. Getting the characteristic curve for a causal network is a measure of how intricately tied together or knotted the risks are with each other. If the line is very linear, then removing one node or one event it means that not many other events get removed as well. Conversely, if the graph is very curved, like this one here, the removal of one event on average removes lots of other events as well. This is a measure of how complex the risk network is. This matters because it gives you a clue about whether you have to be generally awesome and have to work hard at stopping all the risks with equal focus, or whether you can afford to be specifically awesome and just focus on a few key risks along the way. Studying how fragile this structure of the causal network is using methods like this helps you to get a general answer to that question. So for this closure scenario that we were looking at earlier, this table is a list of the top 10 events to preferentially prevent or treat. This is in terms of to most efficiently prevent all the risks from occurring. What I mean by efficiently is simply what is the minimum number of individual risks that need to be prevented and the order in which to do so in order to break up the whole causal network. This represents a kind of upper limit of how effective risk treatment strategies could possibly be within the limitations of this analysis. So for this simplified closure analysis, what the graph is saying is that there are 29 particular events that if they are prevented in a particular order, then all the other risks will be prevented as well. We call this point at which the robustness curve hits the x-axis, so 0 remaining risks in the scenario. We call this the heel point because it kind of looks like a heel. Since the robustness analysis gives you a kind of upper limit of how effective risk treatment strategies could be, this heel point could be interpreted perhaps as the ALARP point. Now, there are many ways to demonstrate if the residual risk is as low as reasonably practicable for a closure scenario. This is just one approach in that if you can show that these 29 particular risks are prevented, and that's the list of the top 10 of them there in the table, or you can show that the risk of those 29 is as low as reasonably practicable, because of their position in the network structure, this kind of analysis, I think, will help to justify to stakeholders that the risk of the whole closure scenario is a LARP. So I'll just say that point again. Because of where these 29 risk events sit in the causal network, if I preferentially remove them in this order, starting with the one at the top, then, or I can show that the residual risk of those events is as low as reasonably practicable, I think that will help to justify that the risk of the whole closure scenario is as low as reasonably practicable. Now, that's a bit of an assertion which hasn't been tested, but I think it's worth exploring. In addition, a handy measure of the complexity of this closure risk network is simply the number of nodes at the heel point, that's 29 in this case, divided by the total number of events in the causal network. So this one was 188. So the difference there is, the quotient there is 15%. The closer this number is to 0, the easier it is, the risk will be to manage in general. Closer it is to 100%, the more complex the risk management will be to achieve the residual risk being a LARP. But it's important to note that this is a model. It may not be practical based on factors like the cost of treating risks or the ease of installation of controls. to treat risks in exactly the order that the above analysis suggests. So for example, if you look at, if you look at the fourth event there, legal obligations and commitments not achieved, the only way to prevent this is to actually do everything you need to do to achieve your legal obligations. This naturally means you need to look at the causes of this risk and address them rather than that event itself. Nevertheless, the above suggested order of risk treatment does tell you something clear about how to progress, that an optimal way of preventing all risks in this particular closure scenario is to start with the above 29 or indeed these 10. Again, it's not the answer, it's just the first place to look. So let's summarize now. How does CaNeTA help you to optimize closure risk management? It helps you to find missing or to ask questions about missing risks and causal links between the events. And we do this by visualizing the causal network. It helps you to find key risks that can significantly derail closure through using the topology metrics to show important events, causally important events. It suggests an optimal order to treat risks in to demonstrate a LARP. This is through the robustness analysis. But it's important to remember that CaNeTA is not a panacea. It tells you the one answer of how to optimize mine closure risk management. It opens a door to thinking in a different way about identifying, analyzing, and treating risks that can be used to integrate many data sources and perspectives from multiple stakeholders in order to help, hopefully, optimize mine closure. Thanks very much. We have a question slide. Has anyone got any questions?
Thanks, Ben. Interesting work. And yes, we do have questions.
Okay. Nick's got his hand up.
Thank you. So in your adjacency matrix, they were just 0 and 1 values.
Yep.
Is there a way to apply
Weighting to the edges?
the numeric parts of the risk of each item so that you end up with a different matrix? And you'd have to, as you mentioned, they have different ranges and frequencies and so forth. So you'd have to normalize the data. But is there a way then to apply that multivariate statistics into that adjacency matrix so you actually had a set of numeric values that applied to that order as well?
So to answer that question, first of all, that's an open research question we are working on. How do you integrate likelihood or frequency and severity data of risk events into this kind of analysis? There's a number of different ways you can try and do that. One way is to attach the severity of a particular event to the node itself. So that's not in the adjacency matrix. That's kind of providing a weighting to the node. In the adjacency matrix, that's the weighting that the edges have. At the moment, that represents the Boolean and and OR gates between events. There are other ways of representing information about causality in this kind of format. It's a very open question as to how do we incorporate frequency data. I think there are two approaches. One way is to treat it like another kind of weighting on the node so that every event will have a vector of values, one of them being the severity, one being the frequency, maybe other ones being the cost to treat it, things like that. And then that reshapes, for example, how you might do robustness analysis because you can incorporate that data as well. Another way of incorporating frequency data is into the network structure itself, into the edge weights. That's a very open question that we're still developing. But obviously, and I'm not surprised you asked that question. I was telling my MPhil student the other day, the first question people are going to ask is, what the heck do I do with my likelihood and consequence data? Like, do I throw that away? No, we don't throw it away. It's useful information. But we need to figure out how to use it with CaNeTA. The way I described just before, that's one way. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. But we were looking for collaborators who have ideas about that. So please feel free to come and talk to me. Rick.
So with the mine closure, with the CaNeTA applied to mine closure, who's going to use it and how are they going to use it? You might have covered this in the 5 minutes where I was late for.
No, I didn't actually. That's a good question.
So I mean, that's the, I remember how we used it in the Ozark Lake thing. I think it was useful. How would you see, how would you see it being used in the closure case? Who and how?
Do you mean who in the next 2 years or who in the generic future?
Generic future.
Yeah. I think pragmatically, it would probably be used by people by the closure team in companies as a way of connecting all the relevant data together about closures together, rather than the government or rather than the local community. But having said that, I feel a little bit underqualified to properly answer that question. I think practically that's what would end up happening. I think the best group of people to use it would be if there was established some kind of regional body that wasn't government, that wasn't companies, that wasn't communities, but perhaps was an agglomeration of the three, that was interested in managing or spearheading closure planning for a particular region. That kind of a body would probably be the best group, I think. Now, I'm just saying that because I've been, as I talk to people around in the social science area who've been very much connected to closure, they've said having some kind of regional body focused on the region to help that, they might be the best place to help to manage closure from anyway. That's why I say that. So there's a few options. But obviously it involves some kind of technical skills to run the method and to facilitate the workshops and to do that kind of thing. So it would have to be, and whoever did it would have to have those sort of resources. It doesn't have to sit within universities forever. Of course not. I think that would kind of not be the goal.
Of course.
I'm just thinking, just imagine a generic, a random place out in the middle of nowhere that's let's say it's got a copper mine and a copper smelter, just randomly speaking. Yeah. And let's say that the copper mine's just about finishing, and every 4 or 5 years they have to decide whether to rebrick the smelter.
Okay.
And you're the government, and the company says, "Oh, we don't have enough money to rebrick the smelter. We're going to have to close down." And the government says, "Ooh, how bad's that going to be?" And it seems to me that this sort of thing would be a really good way for them to say, is it better for us to help this company, to this random generic unspecified company, to rebrick their smelter and continue operating, or is it better for us to just rip the bandage off and devote our resources to something else?
That's a very good point. That's a good point. Yeah.
We have a couple of comments on online. So some of them came in when we were having a discussion halfway through your presentation. Mm-hmm. So it's probably more related to that, but right. I'll read it out anyways. Really interesting how this can be looking for commonalities in goals. Suggest are often many. Example, functioning restoration without residual risk to health of environment / people desired by local people, but have to have an inclusive process like this to do for all of the actors have the same ability to participate in this sort of exercise. Example is being discussed is the Ranger Mine, mm-hmm. And how they have their own cultural criteria to monitor and concerns. This is unusual. Anyway, yeah. So traditional owners and communities do not have the support to develop the understanding of processes or their own methods of assessing progress and risks. From an environmental perspective, we're better at identifying states than drivers of transition because these It takes research at multiple sites over time. Lack of understanding of drivers of transitions is a limitation for this approach, probably.
Yes, absolutely. That's a very good point. I mean, like, I'm not creating the data; we're just integrating the data. And so I think there were two major points there. One was about local communities requiring or could benefit from support to develop their own understanding of what the risks are. Was part of it?
Yeah.
And then there's a limitation on actually getting the data about states and state transitions and drivers environmentally because it's difficult to do that in general. I think that's what I heard. So I think to the first point, one of the benefits of using the causal network process as a process to identify and link risks together in a group conversation is that it kind of, there's no limit on who you can do that with or who you can teach that to, because it's inherently kind of extremely visual and quite interactive. And so regardless of the stakeholder, there is the potential to work there. I'm not sure if that was the gist of your question, but in terms of if the question was, can this method be applied to support communities directly to help them think through what their risks are? Absolutely. And in fact, I think that's a really practical outlet or application of this kind of approach, to just think through how the different risks affecting them are interconnected.
I should have mentioned, so this came from Catherine Harris.
Catherine. Yeah.
So perhaps, you can continue talking.
Absolutely. Yes, that's a very good point.
Yeah.
Kate, thank you for that question. And I appreciate your expertise in this area. Yes, let's keep talking.
And one more question online. What are your thoughts on how this technique could help companies improve their transparency on closure issues in future, communicating with stakeholders and communities? And that's from Lizette.
Transparency was the part of
yes.
it. Yeah. Okay.
Transparency on closure issues. Yes.
Well, if the companies entered into a process where they were intentionally committed to connecting data about a particular closure scenario from as many other stakeholders that were relevant as possible, and then sharing the results of that with those stakeholders or working with those stakeholders to build that data set, that causal network or that risk register. That's the first step, right? So the kind of democratization of the way that those risk workshops can be run, especially if it was facilitated by somebody outside of the companies, so by the government, by the SMI, potentially. The second part of that was before you have the network, you don't know what the answers are as to where the key drivers of the risks are. And so by connecting lots of people's data, what might appear is that the core problem is the tailings dam, or what might appear is the core problem might be what plants we're choosing to grow here, or it might be something else completely entirely in terms of what's driving the network from a topology point of view. And so in terms of transparency, you kind of, until you have everyone else's information, you don't know what's the most important thing to focus on. That's a kind of transparency that's generated because you're opening yourself up to, well, maybe we're the problem or maybe not. I think that's how I would answer that.
Another question did pop up. Do we have any burning questions in the audience? All right, maybe. All right, so that's Duk saying that. Thanks, Ben, for your great presentation. I can see that the causal network for mine closure risk management can be built based on the graph theory. You have showed some results based on that causal network. Example, the heel point result of 15% in priority order. Did you use an existing software or develop your own program for that analysis?
Well, a bit of both, really. So my MPhil student basically used a bunch of Python libraries of existing algorithms to do the robustness analysis. He built a bit of software himself to do that, but that kind of thing can be done in many places. So it's not limited to what we did. Fairly standard network analysis techniques that are already out there.
Thanks, Ben, once again. Probably time to wrap up. Thanks, everyone, for coming. That's fantastic. So before we head off for our tea and biscuits, next week we have another member of the MISC team presenting, and that's Philippa Dodson. Yay! I don't know if you remember that. And she will talk about the currently very hot topic, and that is the dust research conducted here at SMI, I think. Or maybe, yeah. No, you're going to be talking about something else. All right. Please join us then. Yep. Thank you.